Long before skyscrapers and machines, there was an island, wrapped in mist, ruled by kings and forged in legend. It was called England, but it wasn't always the land we know today. How did scattered tribes from the cold north become one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth? Who built the laws, the faith, and the courage that would shape the modern world? And what secrets still lie hidden beneath its castles and cathedrals? This is not just the story of kings and wars, it's the story of an idea that survived 1,000 years, the birth of a nation that changed the course of history. Welcome to Medieval England, the rise of a kingdom. A journey through time, power, and destiny. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us as we uncover the forgotten world that built the one we live in today. Long before England became a kingdom of knights, castles, and kings, it was a quiet island wrapped in mist and mystery. Rolling green hills stretched to the horizon, rivers carved paths through forests, and tiny settlements dotted the land. This was the dawn of a people who would one day shape the course of history. But at the start, England was not even called England. In the early centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, the British Isles were home to many tribes. The native Britons spoke Celtic languages, lived in wooden houses, and farmed the fertile soil. The Romans had left behind roads, walls, and towns. But when their legions withdrew around the 5th century, the island was left open to new waves of settlers. From across the North Sea came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, tribes from what is now Germany and Denmark. They arrived in wooden ships with curved prows, bringing their families, tools, and ancient beliefs. These newcomers did not see themselves as conquerors, but as settlers seeking a new home. Over time, they mingled with the native Britons, and their language began to shape what we now call Old English. The Angles settled in the east and north, the Saxons in the south, and the Jutes in the southeast. From the name Angle came the word England, the land of the Angles. Life in early medieval England was hard but full of hope. People built small villages near rivers and forests where they could hunt, fish, and grow barley, wheat, and rye. They made their homes from wood and thatch, surrounding them with fences to protect animals from wolves. Over time, small communities grew into kingdoms. There were not one or two, but several. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the middle, Wessex in the south, Kent in the southeast, and East Anglia in the east. Each had its own king, warriors, and customs. These kingdoms often traded, sometimes allied, and occasionally fought. Yet, through this constant movement and mixing, the spirit of a united people began to take form. The Saxons brought with them their own gods, Woden, Thunor, and Frege, whose names still echo in our modern days of the week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Their songs and stories spoke of courage, loyalty, and fate, and were passed from one generation to the next by wandering poets called Scops. In the late 6th century, a quiet transformation began. A Roman monk named Augustine arrived on the shores of Kent, sent by Pope Gregory the Great. He came not to conquer, but to teach, to share the Christian faith. King Ethelbert of Kent welcomed him, curious about this new religion. Soon, churches were built, and the first English Christians were baptized. Christianity spread from south to north, bringing with it new ideas about learning, art, and writing. Monasteries became centers of knowledge, where monks copied books by hand and preserved the wisdom of the ancient world. The glow of candlelight on parchment became a symbol of the new age that was slowly dawning. The early English were people of the land. Their songs told of the sea and storms, of loyalty between lord and warrior, and of the eternal struggle between light and darkness. One of their greatest tales, Beowulf, was born in this time, a story of bravery and honor that still echoes today. Their society was built on kinship and loyalty. Every man owed service to his lord, and every lord owed protection to his people. Women played important roles too. managing homes, weaving clothes, and sometimes even ruling estates in their husband's absence. Trade connected the early English to the rest of the world. From faraway lands came silver coins, fine glass, and silk. In return, England exported wool, tin, and slaves. The island that once seemed isolated was now part of a larger European network of commerce and culture. Yet, for many generations, England remained a land divided. Kings rose and fell, and alliances changed like the tide. Still, amid the shifting powers, a dream began to grow. The dream of one kingdom, united under one crown. It was not only about power, it was about identity. The people who once called themselves Angles, Saxons, or Jutes were beginning to see themselves as something new, as English. By the 9th century, one kingdom would rise to lead them all. Wessex, under a wise and brave ruler named Alfred the Great. But that is a story for another time. As the first millennium approached, the landscape of early England had changed forever. Villages had become towns, pagan temples had turned into churches, and scattered tribes had grown into kingdoms. The foundations of law, language, and learning had been laid. From the misty shores of the North Sea to the rolling hills of Wessex, a nation was being born. One forged not by conquest alone, but by endurance, faith, and the quiet strength of its people. And though none could yet see it, the roots of medieval England had already taken hold. The story of kings and castles, of scholars and saints, of courage and discovery, all of it was waiting just beyond the horizon. This was the beginning of England, a beginning carved by the tides of time and destined to echo through centuries. The dawn of the medieval era in England was not marked by sudden change, but by a slow and graceful transformation. Villages grew into towns, wooden halls into stone castles, and scattered beliefs into one shared culture. The once fractured land of small kingdoms began to find its rhythm, its confidence, and its place in history. This was the classical age of medieval England, an age of kings, faith, chivalry, and enduring legacy. By the early 9th century, the dream of unity had begun to take shape. The kingdom of Wessex under King Alfred the Great stood as a beacon of learning and leadership. Alfred was more than a warrior. He was a thinker, a lawmaker, and a believer in education. He built schools, translated Latin texts into English, and strengthened the walls of his towns against the threat of invasion. When other kings thought only of swords, Alfred thought of wisdom. He once said, "A king must have a learned heart, for wisdom is the shield of a nation." His vision turned Wessex into the foundation of a united England, a kingdom that valued both courage and knowledge. After Alfred came his descendants, Edward the Elder, Athelstan, and others, who carried the dream forward. Under King Athelstan, England was finally united as one realm. For the first time in history, people from Northumbria to Kent, from Mercia to East Anglia, could call themselves one nation, the English. As the 10th and 11th centuries unfolded, England took on the familiar shape of the medieval world. The feudal system became the structure of society. The king granted land to his nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service. These nobles, in turn, gave land to knights and farmers who worked the soil. At the heart of every village stood the manor, the center of local life. Surrounding it were open fields divided into strips, where families farmed grain and kept livestock. Peasants or serfs worked hard from dawn until dusk, owing labor to their lords but also receiving protection in return. Life was simple and bound by duty, faith, and the seasons. This was not a time of great luxury for most, but it was a time of balance. Every person, from king to farmer, had a place in the great chain of medieval society, each bound together by loyalty and divine order. If one were to walk through medieval England, the landscape would seem to tell its own story. On distant hills, tall castles rose from the mist, strongholds of power built from cold stone. These fortresses were both homes and symbols, reminders of authority and protection. But where castles stood for strength, cathedrals stood for faith. Across England, grand churches began to rise in Canterbury, Winchester, and York. Their spires reached toward heaven as if trying to touch the divine. Monks filled the halls with chants and prayers, and artists carved stories from stone. Every carving, every stained glass window told tales from the Bible, teaching faith to those who could not read. Religion was the heartbeat of medieval life. The church guided kings and peasants alike, offering not only spiritual comfort, but also education, charity, and justice. Every Sunday, the bells called people to worship, a reminder that beyond the toil of the fields lay the promise of eternity. The classical age was also an age of knights. Young men of noble birth trained from childhood to master the sword, the lance, and the horse. But knighthood was not only about fighting, it was about honor, mercy, and duty. The code of chivalry taught knights to protect the weak, serve their lord faithfully, and uphold justice. In stories sung by minstrels, knights rescued the innocent, defended the church, and pursued noble love. These tales, though often idealized, shaped the dreams and morals of the medieval mind. Tournaments and jousts became symbols of prestige. Knights in shining armor competed not for conquest, but for glory and recognition. The crowds cheered as lances shattered and banners waved in the wind. It was both sport and ceremony, a dance of courage and pride. While kings and knights filled the chronicles, everyday life carried on in quiet rhythm. Farmers plowed their fields with wooden tools, bakers kneaded their bread, blacksmiths shaped iron into tools and weapons. Women managed households, brewed ale, and raised children. Life was harsh, but community made it bearable. Festivals were moments of joy. May Day, harvest feasts, and Christmas brought laughter, song, and dance. Storytellers and musicians traveled from village to village, carrying news and legends. The English language, once rough and divided by dialects, began to evolve. Enriched by Latin from the church and French from noble courts. Yet, even in this age of balance, change was stirring. Across the sea in Normandy, a new power was rising, one that would soon cross the Channel and reshape England once more. The Norman lords spoke a different tongue, followed different customs, and carried ambitions that would test the strength of England's young unity. For now, though, England stood tall, proud, faithful, and flourishing. Its fields were full, its people strong, and its identity clear. The island that had once been divided by tribes now pulsed as a single heart. This was the classical age of medieval England, a time when kings dreamed of justice, cathedrals touched the sky, and the English spirit was forged in faith, loyalty, and hope. It was not yet the England of empire, but it was the England of purpose. And from its solid roots the future would soon bloom. England, the island kingdom that had once been a land of small tribes, now stood as a united realm. But its story was far from peaceful. The sea that surrounded it brought not only trade and ideas, it also brought foreign influences that would shape the destiny of its people forever. From Vikings to Normans, from traders to monks, each left a mark on the growing identity of medieval England. In the late 8th century, when monasteries still echoed with prayers and fields were golden with harvest, sails appeared on the horizon. Long ships, sleek and silent, cut through the waves like arrows. From the cold lands of Scandinavia came the Vikings. Fierce seafarers from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They came seeking wealth and adventure. Their first known attack fell upon the monastery of Lindisfarne in the year 793. The monks, devoted to peace and faith, were unprepared for men who valued strength and courage above all. That day, the Northmen entered the English story, and they would not leave it for generations. But the Vikings were not merely raiders. Over time, many of them settled in England, farming its land and trading with its people. They brought with them their own customs, laws, and language. Towns such as York, Lincoln, and Norwich still carry traces of their Norse origins in name and character. In the eastern part of England, an area known as the Danelaw emerged. Land ruled under Danish law. Here, English and Norse blended into something new, a shared culture born of both struggle and cooperation. English words like sky, egg, husband, and window are gifts from that Viking age. By the middle of the 11th century, England had learned to stand strong again. The Viking age had passed, and a powerful king, Edward the Confessor, sat on the throne. He was known for his piety and fairness, but when he died without an heir, a storm of ambition swept across Europe. Across the English Channel in Normandy, a duke named William claimed that Edward had once promised him the crown. William was not just any nobleman. He was the great-grandson of a Viking, but also a loyal son of the Church. He gathered his knights, built a fleet of ships, and crossed the sea with a single purpose: to take the English throne. In the year 1066, William met the English army led by King Harold Godwinson at a place called Hastings. The battle that followed would change England forever. Harold was defeated, and William became William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England. The Norman conquest was not just a change of ruler, it was a transformation of culture. The Normans brought their language, their architecture, and their way of governance. French became the language of the court and nobility, while English remained the tongue of the common people. From this blending of speech, modern English would eventually be born. Under Norman rule, England began to look very different. Massive stone castles appeared across the countryside, symbols of both defense and dominance. Towering above London rose the Tower of London, a fortress built to remind all who saw it of the king's power. The Normans also reformed the system of law and land ownership. William ordered a great survey of his kingdom, recording every piece of land, every village, and every field in a book called the Domesday Book. It was a record so complete that historians still marvel at it today, a snapshot of England at the dawn of its new era. The church, too, gained strength. Magnificent cathedrals of stone replaced the simpler wooden churches of the Saxons. Norman bishops encouraged learning and the arts, while monasteries grew rich and powerful. From these centers came new manuscripts, new schools, and new hope for education. Foreign influence was not only about conquest, it was also about connection. England's ports opened to merchants from France, Flanders, Italy, and the Hanseatic cities of northern Europe. Markets filled with goods never before seen: fine wine, spices, silk, and coins of gold. English wool, famous for its quality, became a prized export, feeding the growing wealth of the kingdom. Travelers and pilgrims journeyed across the sea to Rome and the Holy Land, returning with stories, relics, and fresh ideas. Scholars began to read classical texts again, rediscovering the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. Slowly, these new ideas would light the path toward learning and innovation. The centuries following the Norman conquest were a time of blending, of language, blood, and belief. The children of English and Norman families grew up speaking both tongues. Their names, customs, and manners reflected both worlds. Even the architecture mirrored this mix. Solid Norman stone merged with graceful English design. By the 12th century, the term Anglo-Norman described this new culture: half Saxon, half French, but entirely English at heart. The people who had once seen each other as conquerors and conquered now shared one destiny. Through it all, England endured. It absorbed every influence: Celtic, Roman, Saxon, Viking, and Norman, and turned them into strength. This ability to adapt, to take from others without losing itself, became the secret of England's survival. Foreigners had reshaped the kingdom, but they had also enriched it. The English language became broader and more expressive. The law grew more organized, the architecture more majestic, and the culture more open to the world. By the end of the 12th century, England had become something truly remarkable. A nation forged by many hands, but guided by one spirit. Its kings ruled with both might and faith. Its people worked with both pride and purpose, and its identity, though born from foreign seeds, had grown into something uniquely its own. This was the gift of the foreign influences, not the loss of England's soul, but the shaping of its character. Out of conflict came culture, and from diversity came unity. The story of England did not end with conquest. In fact, it was only beginning to flourish. After the struggles and unions of past centuries, a new age dawned, one of growth, learning, and transformation. The 12th and 13th centuries marked a golden era of medieval England, when ideas blossomed, cities expanded, and the seeds of democracy began to sprout. It was an age where the strength of the sword slowly gave way to the power of the mind. After the Norman conquest, England entered a period of rebuilding and reorganization. The kings of the 12th century, from Henry I to Henry II, ruled with a steady hand, seeking to unite the diverse people of their realm. They strengthened the government, established royal courts, and introduced systems that would later inspire modern law. Henry II, one of England's most capable rulers, created what became known as common law, a legal system based not on the whim of a king, but on customs and precedent. Judges traveled across the kingdom, hearing cases and recording decisions, ensuring that justice was applied fairly. For the first time, laws were not merely royal decrees, but a shared understanding of right and wrong that belonged to the people. This idea, that law could stand above any ruler, was revolutionary for its time, and it became one of England's greatest contributions to the world. While kings shaped the laws, the people transformed the land. The countryside that had once been dotted with tiny villages now began to fill with towns, centers of trade, craft, and opportunity. Merchants sold cloth, wool, and metalwork in busy marketplaces. Guilds formed to protect tradesmen, set prices, and maintain quality. The wool trade became England's treasure. Its soft, high-quality wool was sought after across Europe, especially in Flanders and Italy. English ports such as Bristol, London, and York grew wealthy from commerce. Ships carried wool out and brought luxury goods in, spices, glass, and fine fabrics that dazzled the imagination. With trade came prosperity, and with prosperity came growth. Streets filled with shops, homes, and inns. Markets buzzed with chatter in both English and Norman French. Bells rang from churches, signaling not just prayer, but progress. For the first time, commoners began to experience a taste of independence and self-worth. As trade enriched the land, another kind of wealth began to spread: the wealth of knowledge. Across England, monasteries remained the guardians of wisdom, preserving ancient manuscripts and teaching young scholars. Yet now, learning began to move beyond the monastery walls. In the 12th century, schools opened in cities like Oxford and Cambridge, which soon grew into great universities. Here, students studied theology, philosophy, medicine, and the law. They debated the writings of Aristotle, read Latin texts, and questioned the nature of truth. Ideas flowed from Europe to England and back again, carried by scholars eager to understand both faith and reason. These centers of learning became the heartbeat of intellectual life in medieval England. They nurtured thinkers who would later shape science, government, and literature. In their crowded halls, the foundation for England's cultural brilliance was quietly being laid. Even as England prospered, the balance between the king and his subjects began to shift. When King John, the son of Henry II, demanded heavy taxes and ruled harshly, his barons rebelled. The kingdom teetered on the edge of chaos until, in the year 1215, they forced the king to sign a document that would forever change the course of history: the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. Written in Latin on parchment, the Magna Carta declared that the king was not above the law. It promised fair trials, protection of property, and limits on royal power. Though it was meant at first only for nobles, its principles grew to inspire all of English society, and, centuries later, the democratic nations of the modern world. The Magna Carta was more than ink and words. It was the birth of freedom. It planted the idea that government should serve the people, not rule them. And in that idea lay the roots of modern democracy. England's prosperity was not only measured in wealth or law, but also in creativity. Stone cathedrals soared into the sky, their pointed arches and stained glass glowing with color. The Gothic style, graceful and light, replaced the heavier Norman architecture of the past. The cathedrals of Canterbury, Lincoln, and Salisbury became masterpieces of devotion and art. In the villages, minstrels and poets sang tales of romance and heroism. Stories like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight captured the ideals of courage and virtue. Meanwhile, scribes in monasteries began to write in Middle English, giving the language new life and rhythm. From these roots, centuries later, the works of Chaucer and Shakespeare would bloom. By the end of the 13th century, England had transformed from a collection of feudal estates into a living, breathing nation. Its laws were strong, its people industrious, and its faith unshaken. The English Parliament began to take shape, first as a council of nobles and clergy, then as an assembly that included representatives of towns. It was the early form of what would one day become one of the world's most influential institutions. England was learning not only how to survive, but how to thrive through cooperation, reason, and growth. The island that had once been shaped by foreign powers was now shaping its own destiny. This was the age of growth, a time when England found its balance between power and wisdom, between the sword and the pen. Out of trade, law, and learning grew a civilization whose influence would one day circle the globe. Every golden age faces its shadow. For all its prosperity and learning, medieval England was not spared from hardship. As the 13th century faded into the 14th, the island that had once stood proud and stable began to tremble under the weight of war, disease, and unrest. The fields that once overflowed with wheat would soon lie empty. The bells that had once rung for joy would toll for mourning. This was the time of crisis, a period that tested the very soul of England. At the dawn of the 14th century, England was ruled by kings who dreamed of power beyond their shores. The greatest of these ambitions led to one of the longest conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War, fought between England and France. The roots of this struggle lay in tangled family ties and claims to the French crown. In the year 1337, King Edward III declared himself the rightful king of France through his mother's lineage. What began as a dispute of inheritance turned into generations of battle. English armies crossed the Channel, led by knights in shining armor and archers with longbows that could pierce armor from 100 yards away. The victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and later Agincourt made England a force to be feared. Yet, for all its triumphs, war drained the nation's strength. Gold from the treasury vanished, farmers were taxed heavily, and families waited years for sons who would never return. War gave birth to legends of courage, strategy, and pride, but it also sowed exhaustion and loss. England gained glory, but at a heavy cost. Just as war scarred the kingdom, a far greater enemy arrived, one that no sword or shield could stop. In the year 1348, a terrible plague swept across Europe. It was carried by ships, rats, and the invisible breath of sickness. Within months, it reached England's shores. The Black Death, as it came to be known, spread with terrifying speed. Villages fell silent, cities emptied, and fields went untended. Entire families vanished within days. The air itself seemed heavy with fear. Chroniclers wrote that the bells of London rang without pause, and that even the priests who buried the dead soon joined them in the grave. It is said that 1 out of every 3 people in England perished. The loss was beyond imagination. Yet in the silence that followed, society began to change. With so many gone, labor became scarce. Farmers demanded better wages, and the rigid order of feudalism began to crumble. Lords could no longer command obedience as easily as before. For the first time, common people began to realize their worth. Out of tragedy came transformation. The Black Death, though merciless, forced England to rebuild not only its economy but also its sense of equality and resilience. By the middle of the 14th century, the survivors of plague and war were weary of suffering. Taxes remained high to fund the never-ending battles in France, and the gap between the rich and poor grew wide. In the year 1381, anger turned into action. A great uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt erupted. Farmers, craftsmen, and townsfolk marched toward London, demanding justice, fair treatment, and an end to oppression. Their leader, Wat Tyler, spoke for thousands who felt forgotten by their rulers. Though the revolt was eventually suppressed, its message could not be silenced. It marked the first great cry for freedom among England's working people, a voice that would echo through centuries to come. Even the young king, Richard II, heard their plea and realized that the kingdom was changing. The age of unquestioned power was ending. During these same years, the Church, once the guiding light of medieval life, began to face doubt and criticism. Many saw corruption in its wealth and questioned the authority of its leaders. Scholars like John Wycliffe argued that people should be able to read the Bible in their own language, not only in Latin. He translated the scriptures into English, an act both bold and dangerous. This movement planted early seeds of reform, challenging the Church to look inward and renew its purpose. Though the Church remained strong, its walls had begun to crack, and through those cracks, new ideas would one day shine. By the end of the 14th century, England was no longer the same land it had been before the crises began. The feudal world of lords and serfs was giving way to a new social order. Towns grew larger and more independent. Merchants gained influence, and the language of the people, Middle English, became the language of literature and law. In these difficult years, one writer captured the heart of his nation. Geoffrey Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales. Through his stories of pilgrims from all walks of life, Chaucer painted a portrait of an England that was struggling, changing, and human. His words gave voice to a people learning to see themselves not only as subjects of a king, but as individuals with hopes and dreams. The 14th century had brought war, plague, rebellion, and spiritual turmoil. Yet through every hardship, England endured. It adapted, learned, and emerged stronger. The people had faced death and despair, but they had also discovered something priceless: the strength of unity and the power of renewal. As the 15th century began, a fresh wind of change swept across the land. The echoes of war still lingered, but new possibilities stirred. In art, science, and exploration, a new age was coming, one that would bridge the medieval and the modern world. This was the lesson of the time of crisis, that even in the darkest hours, the spirit of England refused to fade. Out of struggle came progress. Out of sorrow came strength. And from the ashes of the past, the light of a new dawn began to rise. The 15th century dawned like a quiet morning after a storm. England, weary from centuries of war and plague, stood at the threshold of transformation. The world was changing, slowly, steadily, and irreversibly. The echoes of the medieval age began to fade, giving way to something new, an era of modernization, discovery, and rebirth. For hundreds of years, England had been ruled by the feudal order, a pyramid of power where kings ruled through nobles and peasants worked the land in exchange for protection. But after the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt, this system was dying. Now, men and women were moving away from the countryside into towns. Markets grew. Trade expanded. The merchant, once a humble figure, became powerful. Wealth was no longer tied to land alone. It could now be earned through commerce, craft, and ambition. London, York, and Bristol became bustling centers of trade. Ships from distant lands brought silk, spices, and precious metals. In return, English wool, fine and sought after, was shipped across Europe. England's merchants became the beating heart of a growing economy, their gold rivaling that of the nobility. This shift in power began to reshape the kingdom. A new class emerged, not noble by birth, but influential by skill and wealth. They were the early builders of England's modern society. But the path to modernization was not peaceful. Beneath the glittering trade routes and city walls, the crown itself wavered between two rival families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. Their struggle for power became one of the most infamous civil wars in English history, the Wars of the Roses, named after the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. For 30 years, from the middle of the 15th century, England was torn apart by betrayal, shifting loyalties, and bloodshed. Kings were crowned and killed. Brothers turned on brothers. Castles burned. In the midst of this chaos rose figures of both ambition and tragedy. Richard III, remembered as the last Plantagenet king, whose reign ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field in the year 1485. His defeat marked the end of an era. The crown passed to a new ruler, Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. With his victory, the long and deadly conflict finally ended, uniting the two roses into one, the red and white Tudor rose, symbol of peace and renewal. Under Henry VII, England began to heal. Roads were repaired, trade flourished once more, and royal authority grew stronger. For the first time in generations, the kingdom had peace, a foundation upon which to build something lasting. The Tudor Dynasty, born from blood and ambition, would lead England into one of its most transformative centuries. The rule of Henry and his successors marked the beginning of England's journey into the modern world. Bureaucracy replaced feudal loyalty. The royal court became the center of administration, diplomacy, and culture. The king's power was absolute, but it was guided by calculation and reform, not chaos and feud. While the sword had once shaped destiny, now the mind began to do so. Across Europe, a wave of intellectual awakening, the Renaissance, began to reach England's shores. New ideas arrived from Italy and France: art, science, literature, and humanism. Scholars began to look beyond the strict doctrines of the Middle Ages, rediscovering the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Learning became fashionable once again. Oxford and Cambridge expanded their influence as centers of thought. Books, once rare and hand-copied, became more accessible with the invention of the printing press. When William Caxton set up England's first printing press in Westminster in the year 1476, the written word became a power of its own. Knowledge could now spread faster than armies, shaping minds across the nation. For the first time, English literature, law, and philosophy found a voice that reached beyond the elite. Amid these intellectual sparks, questions began to rise. Questions about faith, authority, and the Church. Though England still followed the Pope in Rome, whispers of reform could already be heard. Wycliffe's earlier calls for an English Bible were remembered, and quiet discontent simmered beneath the surface. The people had seen the corruption of wealth and power within the Church, and many longed for a purer faith. This tension between old belief and new thought would soon explode. Not yet, but soon, in a storm that would forever change England's spiritual life. Every layer of society felt the wind of change. In towns, craftsmen formed guilds to protect their trades and train apprentices. Markets thrived, and coins replaced barter. Inns along the king's roads bustled with travelers and merchants exchanging news and ideas. In the countryside, the great manors of feudal lords began to decline. Many were converted into enclosed farms for sheep grazing, a profitable business that further expanded England's wool trade. And in art and architecture, England began to reflect its new age. The perpendicular Gothic style rose, with tall, slender windows and intricate stonework. Cathedrals gleamed in sunlight once more, symbols not only of devotion but of human creativity. By the end of the 15th century, England stood reborn, not yet the empire it would become, but a nation awakening from medieval slumber. It had endured centuries of turmoil and emerged wiser, stronger, and ready for the future. The foundations of modernization were laid: centralized power, economic expansion, intellectual curiosity, and the beginnings of a new identity. The medieval kingdom had evolved into a dynamic realm of trade, learning, and ambition, a kingdom that looked no longer inward but outward toward the world. From the ashes of war and plague, England had risen again. A new dawn glowed on the horizon, and with it the promise of exploration, reform, and empire. As the 16th century unfolded, the kingdom that had once been divided and uncertain began to step onto the grand stage of world history. England was no longer a quiet island of farmers and warriors. It had become a power of faith, discovery, and destiny. From the court of the Tudors to the farthest seas, the name England began to echo beyond its shores. The reign of Henry VIII marked a turning point that would shape not only England, but the world itself. At first, Henry ruled as a loyal Catholic king, honored by the Pope as the defender of the faith. Yet, his heart and ambition led him down a path that would transform his nation forever. When the Pope refused to grant him a divorce, Henry made a decision that no English ruler had dared before. He broke away from the authority of Rome. In the year 1534, the Church of England was born, with the king as its supreme head. This act of separation was not only political or personal, it was spiritual. It redefined loyalty, reshaped power, and placed England at the center of Europe's great religious divide. Monasteries were closed, their wealth absorbed into the crown. The English Bible was printed, allowing ordinary people to read Scripture in their own language for the first time. The Reformation gave England a new sense of identity: independent, sovereign, and defiant. It also gave birth to centuries of debate and division that would echo through the world wherever English ships and settlers would one day sail. When Queen Elizabeth I ascended the throne in the year 1558, England stood on the edge of uncertainty. The nation had been torn between Catholic and Protestant loyalties, threatened by enemies abroad and conspiracies at home. Yet under her reign, England entered what would be remembered as its golden age. Elizabeth was wise, cautious, and deeply devoted to her realm. She balanced power with grace, diplomacy with strength. Under her rule, England found peace within and pride without. The arts flourished. Poets like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe captured the soul of the age, while explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh carried the English flag across unknown oceans. In the summer of 1588, the Spanish Armada, a mighty fleet sent by King Philip of Spain, sailed to conquer England. Against all odds, the English navy, smaller but swifter, triumphed. Storms scattered the invaders, and England was saved. It was more than a military victory. It was a symbol of divine favor and national unity. From that moment, England was no longer a mere island kingdom. It was a rising maritime power. The seas, once barriers, became highways to the future. As ships set sail for distant lands, England's reach began to extend far beyond Europe. Explorers mapped coasts, traders sought gold and spices, and settlers built new lives across the Atlantic. In the early 17th century, the first English colonies were founded in North America. Small, uncertain beginnings that would one day grow into vast nations. With every voyage, the English language and spirit spread across oceans, carried by sailors, scholars, and dreamers alike. England's story became intertwined with the story of the world, of exchange, exploration, and empire. The printing press and the compass had joined hands, and together they carried English thought and culture to new horizons. While explorers charted the seas, thinkers and inventors were charting the universe. The spirit of discovery that defined the Renaissance found fertile soil in England. Men like Francis Bacon laid the foundations of modern science through the study of reason and evidence. Isaac Newton, born in the following century, would reveal the laws of motion and gravity that govern the cosmos itself. These ideas transformed not only England, but human understanding across the world. At the same time, England's political life evolved. Parliament grew stronger, shaping laws and limiting the power of monarchs. Though the road to democracy was long and often uncertain, the idea of government by consent, that rulers should serve the people, took deep root here. It was a seed that would one day inspire revolutions on other continents. By the end of the 16th century, England had changed beyond recognition. Once a patchwork of feudal lands and warring lords, it was now a unified, literate, and ambitious nation. Its ships sailed to every horizon, its poets captured the human heart, and its faith gave it a purpose unlike any other. England's rise reshaped the balance of the world. The empire that would later emerge was not yet built, but its foundations were already forming. In the courage of sailors, the ink of writers, and the vision of kings and queens who saw beyond their shores. What made England's role in world history so profound was not merely its power, but its ideas, the belief in learning, liberty, and the rule of law. From these roots grew institutions, literature, and technologies that continue to influence civilizations far from its green fields. The English language became a bridge between nations, the stage for diplomacy, trade, and art. The same small island that once feared invasion became the heart of exploration, innovation, and thought. Through struggle, faith, and determination, medieval England had transformed itself, from a scattered realm of tribes into a power whose influence would one day span the globe. As the 17th century dawned, the kingdom stood poised for even greater change. Science, politics, and global discovery were reshaping not only England but humanity itself. The medieval world was fading, but its echoes still lingered, in the cathedrals, the castles, and the hearts of the people. The story of England was not over. In truth, it was only beginning. For the empire, the revolutions, and the modern age still lay ahead. The story of medieval England does not end in the shadows of castles or the whispers of ancient chronicles. It continues, in every word, law, and idea that shapes our modern world. From the green hills of Wessex to the towers of London, from the ink of monks to the digital screens of today, the legacy of that island kingdom lives on. By the dawn of the 17th century, the medieval world had begun to fade like the last glow of sunset. The once mighty castles became symbols of history, not power. Knights gave way to scholars, merchants, and inventors. The sword was replaced by the pen, and the battlefield by the printing press. The old rhythms of feudal life, bound by loyalty and land, yielded to new ideas of freedom, education, and progress. Towns became cities, and trade networks reached across oceans. The English language, once a local tongue of farmers and poets, grew into a global bridge connecting countless cultures. What had begun as a cluster of small kingdoms had become something far greater, a nation that looked beyond itself toward the wider world. One of England's greatest gifts to the world was not its armies or conquests, but its ideas of governance. From the Magna Carta of the 13th century, a parchment signed beneath the oaks of Runnymede, came a simple yet revolutionary principle, that even kings are bound by law. That idea spread through the centuries, shaping parliaments, constitutions, and democracies across continents. It became the foundation of modern liberty, the belief that power must answer to the people. The English Parliament, born in medieval times as a council of nobles and clergy, evolved into a voice of citizens and commoners. Its model would inspire revolutions, in America, in France, and beyond, proving that the spirit of self-governance could not be contained by time or empire. The rule of law, freedom of speech, and the right to representation. All these cornerstones of modern democracy trace their roots back to medieval England, see slow and patient journey toward justice. The English language itself is perhaps the most enduring legacy of medieval England. Forged from Latin, Norse, and Saxon tongues, it carries echoes of every age, from the chants of monks to the verses of Shakespeare. The stories once told by firelight of Beowulf, Arthur, and Robin Hood evolved into plays, poems, and novels that would enchant the world. In the centuries that followed, English literature became one of humanity's greatest treasures, expressing love, loss, faith, and freedom in every form imaginable. Today, the language of medieval England is spoken by billions, in homes, schools, and parliaments around the globe. Its journey from a misty island to a world stage is itself a miracle of history. The medieval scholars who studied stars and scripture laid the groundwork for the scientific revolutions to come. Their curiosity, born in candlelit monasteries and early universities, grew into the age of discovery and reason. When Isaac Newton gazed at the falling apple, when Charles Darwin explored the mysteries of life, when British engineers built the first railways and steam engines, they were continuing a legacy of learning that began in medieval abbeys and royal schools. The same disciplined thought that once copied ancient texts now powered telescopes, machines, and inventions that would change the course of humanity. In later centuries, England's influence would spread across the world through trade, colonization, and culture. The English Empire would become one of the largest in history, a network of peoples and nations connected by commerce, language, and governance. Yet empire also brought questions of justice, equality, and conscience. As time moved forward, England and its descendants learned to reflect on their past, to celebrate their achievements while acknowledging the struggles that came with power. The legacy of medieval England thus became not only about might, but about morality, the ongoing challenge to use influence with wisdom and compassion. The modern age and the memory of the past. Walk through modern England today, and the echoes of the medieval world are everywhere. The great cathedrals, Canterbury, York, Winchester, still rise above their cities, their bells tolling across the centuries. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge still teach in cloisters once walked by monks. In Parliament, laws are still debated in a chamber built upon traditions more than 700 years old. And across the English countryside, ancient stone bridges and crumbling towers stand as silent witnesses to the age that gave birth to a nation. Even in technology and art, the medieval spirit of craftsmanship endures. In architecture that honors Gothic arches, in literature that revisits Arthurian legends, and in the quiet respect for history that defines British identity. The story of medieval England is not simply a tale of kings and battles, it is the story of transformation, of how a land shaped by faith, war, and imagination became the cradle of modern thought and democracy. Its people built cathedrals of stone and words of law. They turned hardship into endurance, isolation into exploration, and tradition into progress. Every age since has inherited something from that time, a belief that humanity can rise above darkness, that knowledge can conquer ignorance, and that freedom, once kindled, can light the world. And so, the island that once dreamed of unity became a symbol of resilience and renewal. From medieval fields and monasteries grew the roots of a civilization that would inspire centuries of art, science, and reform. The legacy of medieval England lives not in the past, but in the present, in every act of learning, justice, and creativity that defines modern life. As long as people value truth, seek knowledge, and cherish freedom, the spirit of that distant age will never fade. England, the land once born from mist and myth, became not merely a place on a map, but an idea that still shapes the world today and will continue to guide tomorrow. From the mists of the Dark Ages to the dawn of a modern world, we've traveled through centuries of courage, faith, and discovery. The story of medieval England is not just the story of a kingdom. It's the story of humanity's unbreakable will to rise, rebuild, and remember. If this journey has inspired you, if it's made you see history not as something distant, but as something alive, then our purpose has been fulfilled. Thank you for watching and being part of this adventure through time. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video, so more people can discover the untold stories that shaped our world. History is not over. It's still being written, and together, we'll keep uncovering it.